Good evening, everyone. Welcome to welcome to the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural National Historic Site. My name is Spencer Morgan. I'm the Executive Director. My pleasure to welcome all of those in person here to the site and those who are online this evening. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our talk this night with Jim Mendola, a dear donor and friend to the Theodore Roosevelt site. We're so glad that you're here with us, Jim. A couple of housekeeping items for everyone. For those in the room at the end of the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and our lovely sister Pat in the back will bring a microphone to you so you can ask your questions. And for those online, please enter your questions into the chat and Pat will read your question aloud. But without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Mendola. Jim grew up in Buffalo's West Side. He was an Army combat medic from 1967 to 1968, graduated with history honors from Canisius. He holds a master's in library science from SUNY Buffalo and retired after 37 years as the medical librarian for the Buffalo VA Hospital. 10 years as a volunteer archivist and historian for the Buffalo Homestead Park Conservancy. I'm a YPOP alum, so thank you for all of your work for the Conservancy. Library Advocate of the Year for the Western New York Library Resources Council and co-volunteer of the year with his wife Nancy to time. Nancy, can you wave for those in the audience? Hi Nancy, thank you for being with us tonight. Both co-volunteers of the year for the Olmsted Park Conservancy. Jim never lost his librarian's voice in generously supporting the collection development goals of the TR site. Libraries and collections are at the heart of every historian's story, and Jim is committed to keeping that heart healthy and vital. Without further ado, Jim Mendola.
Well, thanks for coming tonight in this beautiful weather. I was expecting maybe people would bail out. It's great. I want to thank Spencer for his kind introduction and especially Pat Zarpa and Amy Sanderson for suppressing my Luddite tendencies with technology and getting me through all this. Now tonight's presentation won't really have much rhyme or reason. I think due to my volunteer historian role in the parks for 10 years, it'll be a little heavier on the parks. But we will have a couple sidebars for Roosevelt, and we'll get to that eventually. But now I'm kind of, these end up just being stories, and all the people that you'll see tonight are long gone. So as a historian, what I'm doing is just chasing shadows. So we'll start off kind of bringing you back to school. The evolution of postcards and a short stint on the origin of stereo views. Now, this first card is what they call a pioneer postcard. The government printed those with postage paid fronts, and they were mainly used for government announcements. This was one out of Buffalo where a street commissioner was telling poor Mr. Dickinson that he was responsible for making the sidewalk in front of his house at his own expense. Now, if he didn't do it, the city would do it and bill him. Now, this is the driver to our sort of modern postcards. This Chicago Exposition in 1893 had souvenir cards that they would hand out, but you couldn't mail them. And people would be exchanging these cards to one another. And then eventually they wanted to know why they couldn't mail them to their friends. So there was a little bit of pressure coming on to get the mailable postcards. This is another one with Bell's Buffalo Soap. Companies would advertise on this, and then you could get them as premiums for buying your products. This Bell's Buffalo Soap was based in Buffalo and was eventually brought out by the Larkin Company. Now, in 1897, Congress passed a law that they would allow some private companies to do postcards, but they couldn't call them postcards because the government was still printing their own. So it was private mailing cards. Now the question I have for you is that card at the top. What is revolutionary about that card?
Women on bicycles?
You're halfway there. How did they pedal the bicycles?
Wrestling. Bloomers.
Pantaloons. Those were invented by Amelia Bloomer. And they stopped calling them pantaloons and started calling them bloomers. She was the assistant postmistress at Seneca Falls. And was very involved in the Seneca Falls women's movement. As a matter of fact, she introduced Katie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. So their relationship started because of Amelia Bloomer. She started getting concerned about how corsets and dresses were really a pain in the neck for women. And she took I think it was an A-line skirt, split it down the middle, sewed it up into pants with a high ankle on it, and away they went. So women now could get out of the house. They didn't have to depend on men for transportation. They could also start playing sports. They could play basketball, tennis, and go for hikes. And they didn't have to worry about the dresses they were wearing. Okay, this is an undivided back card. The years on this is about 1901 to 1907. Now they left a small space at the bottom for the message, but it was only supposed to be the address on the back. And this was the divided back card that came in 1907. And this was sort of the golden age of postcards then. At that time, they were selling hundreds of millions of them. In 1907, they sold over 600 million cards, and the population was 84 million. So that's probably why there's so many of these around today. There's a market in Buffalo, one of the open air markets that used to be downtown. Then, about 1915, when World War I broke out, almost all the postcards before then were made in Germany. They would send a picture to the German publishers and they would make a postcard from them. And their presses were much more advanced than the American ones. So when their businesses were cut off because of the war, the American publishers started printing it, but they had the white border because they wanted to save ink. And again, we get to the linen cards. This is about 1930 to 1945. And the rag content in the paper was so heavy that people thought it felt like linen. So they call them linen cards. There is one more from 45 on, polychrome cards, the ones that are used to now. I don't collect those, so I just don't have any examples for them. Now these cards, the divided backs, had that small space at the bottom too, that you could write a message. And if you strayed off of that bottom line and the post office caught it, they would take it aside as unmailable. And then they would probably hand it to Bartleby and he would put it in the dead letter office.
So are these all penny postcards?
Yeah, up until about the 1930s, they were a penny. And to show you how tight things were with the government cards, the first one that went up, people or merchants could actually buy blank ones, but you had to pay 2 cents postage, and they couldn't afford to do it and sell them at a profit. Because an extra penny in those days is worth 35 cents now. So they couldn't turn over a profit. Now there's a wholesaler of postcards. The merchants could come in and select what they wanted and then bring them to their store. And they would have big displays of postcards. for people to look over. And this was the pricing, so you can see where 1 cent would make a big difference. You just couldn't make a profit. And then there were people that were collecting even then. Here's somebody who would send out these announcements to various people in towns and offer to switch visions of his town with visions of their town. So the collecting started almost immediately. Now this one is kind of interesting. If you were suspecting that someone was reading your postcards and you wanted to tell your girlfriend that you were in love with her or you missed her, you could put the postage stamp in a certain direction and she would get the message, but no one else would. Now for stereo viewers, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who was wounded 3 times in the Civil War, was a Supreme Court justice for 30 years, but it's not him, it's his father. His father became fascinated by stereo views, which at the time were made out of glass. And he had to use a rather large machine to look at them. So he figured there's got to be a simpler way. So he invented this way of looking at stereo views. And then wrote a 15-page article in the Atlantic pursuing the advantages of this and how you could actually make your own stereo views. So here's a lady looking at stereo views, and there's a cabinet to her right that was specially made to store stereo views. And people would have dinners and parties and just to view their stereo views. And this poor, I don't know, I think it's an Arctic fox sitting in front of the fireplace there. Now this is what Oliver Wendell Holmes saw that was kind of clumsy but interesting. They had stations where they would rotate through about 50 glass stereo slides, and they were hand colored. And they would change them once or twice a week to make sure they were topical. So you pay a nickel or a dime and see stereo views every week. This is a stereo view camera to make sure that you have both shots lined up correctly. And this is the guy taking a panoramic view of a city. He's wearing street shoes. I don't know how in the hell he got out there. And this is the type of shot he would be taking. That's Buffalo. And then this would be an amateur slide. You've got instructions on how to make them, and there's a handwriting on the bottom. Fellow was visiting Niagara Falls, decided to do a little fishing. And there's falls from the same trip. Now the next slide shows you how often you could get your postcards. Now in Buffalo, they would deliver the mail two times a day to your residence and 5 times a day to a business. Now the Larkin Company really fed off this, and that's why they were such a success. That didn't change until 1923 when they cut back to 5 to 4, in 1950 when they cut everything back to 1 day. So you could send out a postcard in the morning with a dinner invitation, and by the next morning you would get an acceptance. Now those cards that you just saw were one that was made by a Buffalo card maker. There were 3 sisters that dominated the postcard business in Buffalo. There was this Lillian Pease, who was on Laurel Street. And then I'll get to the other ones a little bit. At that time, this was the main way of communicating. You could send a postcard and then tell them to write you a letter, and they would get a little angry if they didn't get a letter back pretty soon. Because that was the only way they had of catching up with people, what was happening with the family, their friends. And Miss Pease was heavily involved in the temperance unit. And she would make cards to support the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Now, the other sister was Geraldine Prince, and she made cards on Lancaster Avenue. And all of her cards were not butterflies and bluebirds. There's some stereotyping in there. You got your mammy taking care of the white baby after the birth announcement. And you've got African American language in theirs, and Oriental, just not very good. And then the last person was a man who had immigrated from Dresden, Hans Leo Wohler. So there were so many Germans still in the city that he would do cards all in English or all in German or a combination. And that's how they're going. Now we'll get into the parks a little bit. In the 1870s, in Delaware Park, some of the first electric boats in the country were used for tour boats. The only thing I've been unable to find is how they generated and renewed the batteries. But I'll get to that someday. And the Pan Am exhibit had a lot of canals running through it, and even some replicas of bridges from Venice. And they brought in gondolas and gondoliers from Italy. Now, where that comes into play in the parks is they, when the exposition was over, a couple of the gondolas ended up in the lake. The problem they had with it is nobody knew how to steer them. The gondoliers had all gone back to Italy. So what happened is, as they experimented with it, they kept crashing into the shoreline. And eventually they just destroyed the gondolas, so they disappeared. Also, people don't know that there were swan boats in Buffalo. In the early 1890s, there was a concession to bring swan boats to Delaware Park Lake. But as part of his contract, the guy was supposed to maintain the swan boats, and he didn't. So 3 summers later, the floats sprang leaks and sunk and tossed the people into the water. The water is only about 5 feet deep, so they weren't in real danger as long as they got the kids out, I guess. But it happened again, and the Parks Commission said that's it. You know, they canceled his contract, and the swan boats disappeared. Now, in 1906, they had Children's Day in the park. It was in Crump Park, Casanova Park, and Delaware Park. It was supposed to be for parents, students, and teachers. And between the 3 parks, 75,000 people showed up. And it was free transportation and a free lunch. So I don't know how they managed that lunch. But that was it. They never held it again. It's just too much. And that's a typical Sunday afternoon in the park. And I get a kick out of the way that everyone's in their Sunday best, you know, you just wouldn't see it now. There's a regimental band that's playing in the bandstand and lots of people in their boats. Just looks like a gay time. That's the original boathouse that Calvin Bax, Calvert Bax, Olmsted's partner designed. It was torn down in 1899 because they were getting ready for the Pan Am and they thought it was too old fashioned. So down and it was replaced by the casino that's there now. The casino is missing the top floor where the restaurant help lived. And there was a restaurant on the second floor. And it was E.B. Green that designed it. But it was in the Venetian style. And the main component of that is a line of arches. Now, a lot of the car manufacturers in town used to like to pose their cars by Delaware Park. This one's from Pierce Arrow. It was a car made for the Shah of Iran. And there was still a Shah there. And this is the Playboy. Lou Horowitz, who owned the firm, would use his wife as a model, saved him a little bit of money. They only existed for about 3 years. They were supposed to be an economical car for the returning GIs to buy. It had a top speed of 70 miles an hour and would get 40 miles to the gallon. He just couldn't raise enough capital to keep it going. So there were only about 100 of them built, and about half of them are still around. But the story, probably some of you know this story, that the Playboy symbol, Hugh Hefner had a friend whose mother worked with the Playboy car company, and he remembered this symbol, thought it was pretty classy. So a few years later, when he started his magazine, he called it Playboy. That's where the name came from. Now, this is the original cast iron bridge that's over Lincoln Parkway now. And that's William McMillan, who was the park supervisor for 30 years until he got fired because he didn't want any of the Pan Am buildings on park. You can see a little push outs on the bridge. People could sit there and watch the world go by. Once again, they tore it down as being too old fashioned when the Pan Am was in it. And this is what they replaced it with, the Bridge of the Three Americas, North, Central, and South America, the theme of the fair. Now those, E.B. Green designed that too, and you can see the Venetian arches in a row. And people ask about the lines. They were made out of plaster, and they were only meant to last for a few years. They tried to replace it with bronze lions, but they just couldn't raise the money. And that's folks going and coming to the exposition over the bridge. And that was a proposed restaurant for the exposition. Really something. Supposed to be a restaurant observation tower. Never made it. It's too bad. Now Olmsted liked to have this park look finished when it was done. So he would move in mature trees to transplant in the parks. This was one way of transporting them. There was a company, Sardinia, that specialized in that. And this is how they got them out of the ground. Now, he was so avid to do that that when they built Sing Sing prison, he had the trees put on barges and brought down the Erie Canal to transplant into the parks. Now this is how they trim the trees. I don't know how they That guy's up there, he must have been. Just crazy. Now in the winter, they would lower the lake to 3 feet, so it would freeze faster, and if anyone fell in, they had a chance of getting out. Now the up to 5,000 people would come and skate on the lake. And because of the corsets, the woman would have to hire a boy to tie and untie her skates. They ran a toboggan off the second floor of the casino. They had a mechanism to lift it up into there. And then off you went. They also would run jalopies up and down the lake. And they had horse races also. It was almost even mile back and forth down the length of the lake. So it was popular for betting. Now this is Georgia Paulsha. He was a French ace who was doing a tour in the US to raise money for the Red Cross. Came to Buffalo for a couple of days, much feasting and ceremony. That's his stag plane. But what would happen is he would land and take off from the meadow, the great meadow in the park, and he would hold mock fights with the Air Arm and the National Guard. And of course, knowing all the combat moves, he would always get behind them and defeat them. And the first donations to the park animals were 2 buffalo that were considered so tame that they were released into the park. At the time, the park had a fence around it, so they didn't wander to the neighborhoods. But what happened then is the young men and the boys would tease the buffalo, and they start getting more aggressive. So they had to put up a warning sign, and eventually they built a separate paddock to hold them, along with a couple of elk and some deer, and that was the start of the Buffalo Zoo. Now this is a little strange. I haven't figured out where that cat comes from. Whether it was their cat, it must have been. It looks like it's pretty well fed. Now, if you look in the back, that's the Elmwood Avenue Bridge, the old Elmwood Avenue Bridge. If you look at that road in the back, that was actually a parkway that ran around Skidjackwada Creek. And there shows the length of it. It went all the way to Great Street. They were gonna put another one up at the top, but they couldn't get enough easements. And beyond the Elmwood Avenue Bridge, there was a 4-acre lake. They had dammed up Skidjackwada Creek, and that lasted until the mid-40s. What happened is the city donated land to Buff State so they could expand. They were getting a lot of the GIs on the GI Bill, and they needed more space. So in 1945, as they expanded, they eliminated the parkway and the lake. Now that's Mrs. Georgia Pardee and her granddaughter Elizabeth. She donated Gate Circle to the city, paid for it, in memory of her parents, who owned the Ellicott Square building. So she had pretty good trust fund.
Is her last name Gates?
No, it was Pardee. Gates was her maiden name.
Oh,
Yeah. So anyway, E.B. Green designed that, and she also in 1908, donated $160,000 to build Children's Hospital. Before that, it was more a clinic, and her donation made it a full-fledged hospital. It would be the equivalent of $5.5 million today. Now in the background, that wall is a whispering wall. You could sit at either end and whisper, and the other person will get it. But there's been so many accidents there that I'm not sure it still works. Now there's also two metal urns. When you go past, you can notice them. They were designed by Fraser, Mr. Fraser, who was a sculptor that made the Buffalo nickel. He also made the World War I victory medal. And there's a famous sculpture he did of a defeated Native American called The Last Trail, where he's exhausted and his poor horse has got his head through. There's the Children's Hospital that she had built. Now that's the bridge on the S-curves. They only had one road at the time. They didn't build the second S-curve until the 1920s. But you can see the fence that was around Delaware Park. At one time it was a wood fence, high maintenance, I would guess. And eventually they built it as a cast iron fence, which got melted down for war scrap at some point. Now this guy is a lamplighter right at that same bridge. They had coal gas lamps, and he had to replace the mantles as they burned out. You can see he's got a pocket full of the mantles, and he would just go like riding around the city and do that. And you all have probably passed the coal gas plant with the side of it that's still left. You know, when you go on the thruway, you usually pass that right by. Now, there were twin bandstands at Front Park and Humboldt Park. Here's the one at Front Park. Here's the one at Humboldt Park. In a close-up view. What happened is bands about late 1940s refused to go up there. They wanted portable bandstands. So they tore them down. And here's Humboldt Park was revised in 1896 by Olmsted's sons, who had taken over his firm because he had Alzheimer's. They redid Humboldt Park with water features. There's the wading pool, there's a lily pond next to it, and a spray fountain. Now what's interesting here is the picnic grounds. What they did is they had a lot of pathways in there, and they would put winter hardy local animals in cages on wheels so that people could pass them by while they were walking, and with the wheels they could change their locations. I guess for the amusement of the walkers. Kind of probably bears and foxes and squirrels, things. There's the lily pond. The police would go nuts because the kids would go in there hunting pollywogs and picking the blossoms on the lilies to bring home. There's the wading pond. It was at the time the biggest in the world. Now it's a spray pond now. They couldn't return it to being a wading pond because with the current safety rules, it would take 33 lifeguards to cover it. And there's the lodge in what Olmsted would call a comfort station, just the bathrooms. That has been renovated by the Olmsted Conservancy. And the greenhouse next to it is the last greenhouse in the system. And it used to have a public area in the front where you could see flower displays. And the Conservancy is restoring that so that there'll be a small public area for people to go in when they go to MLK Park. Now, this is the tussock moth. In 1902, it appeared in the area, and it's very destructive. It eats almost every kind of tree, you know, oak, maple, elm. So there was, by 1903, it was kind of really having an effect on the city trees. So what they did was in 1904, the Parks Commission offered to pay children 10 cents a quart for the cocoons and the eggs. And on the right-hand side, I get a kick out of this little kid who took his father's hat and filled it up. Now they paid for it for 3 years. And by the time the 3rd year ended, the tussock moth had been wiped out by these kids. They did 30,000 quarts. That's the lake at Casanova Park. Casanova Creek changed its bed after a big storm, and they couldn't get the water in there anymore. And by 1950, it had turned stagnant, and they filled it in. And the same thing, that's Riverside Park with the minnow ponds. And again, it was a water issue. They're 200 yards from the Niagara River, and they couldn't get water circulating in there, so it turned stagnant, and they got rid of the minnow ponds. Now in Humboldt Park was originally called the Parade because the grounds were supposed to be for military displays, and it just didn't work out very well that way. So that by 1896, when they redesigned the park, they were ready to change course. Now the Parade House was 250 feet long, 75 feet deep. It was the largest place that Calvert Golf had ever designed. Here's another view of it. That's what the inside looked. And there's the beer hall. I'll tell you. Here's another shot of the Parade House. Schwabel Brothers contracted with a couple named Bill and Deli Thompson. Bill had been an aeronaut and jumped out of balloons at both bears and parachuted out. But in 1893, there was a financial disaster and he could no longer find work. And he had 4 kids. So what he agreed to do was jump off the highest point of the Parade House. And he practiced in his tenement. Him and his wife practiced with a big umbrella, jumping off the 3rd floor of their tenement. And then in July, he came to do the stunt. 20,000 people were there to watch. And his wife and 4 kids were there too, because she was supposed to take 2 jumps and he would take 2 jumps. He went up first, did the jump, but it was a windy day and it caught the umbrella off to the side and he crashed to the ground. It was taken to Buffalo General and died a few hours later. So his wife collected $250 and then disappeared in history. I don't know what happened to her.
Yeah.
Now I have some cannon pictures now. In the early 1880s, the Philadelphia Naval Yard offered these obsolete naval cannons to any city that wanted them. So Buffalo took 25 of them, put them in the circles and the parks and the monuments. There's a couple in Front Park at the bandstand. There's one at Front Park again, and that's the Lake House. It had a beautiful view of the mouth of the Niagara River and Lake Erie. But a couple of winters worth of storms just ate away at the fancy work, so they took it down, couldn't afford to keep it up. There's Soldier's Place. And they have cannonballs at some of these sites. The guy on the right, I don't know why, but he reminds me of James Joyce. And there's Soldier's Place again, showing a little bit more of the cannons, and there's a sightseeing bus behind. Now what happened was there were car crashes into the cannons, and Frank Coons, who was the park commissioner in the 1930s, condemned them all as traffic hazards. So they hauled them all away for scrap. There's one coming off Soldier's Place. They missed two of them. There were two cannons around the 1812 monument in Delaware Park. And actually the park department hauled them away in the 1970s, but then just dumped them next to a city garage. And they were rediscovered in about 2010. And they got rejuvenated and were sent to the Front Park. So there's two of them left in the Front Park. Now this is the 13th Regiment at Fort Porter, which is where the Peacebridge entrance is now, practicing their firing. They were sent to Cuba in 1898 and ended on Roosevelt's flank, charging up San Juan Hill. And they actually got to the trenches first, but Roosevelt had the name, so he got the glory. They lost about a third of their men on the way up. And as a result, they were always called the Fighting 13th after that. And this is their homecoming, 1898. And they left Fort Porter in 1899. Because Fort Porter had been decommissioned for a while. But then they reopened it as General Hospital number 4, which is the first hospital dedicated to PTSD in the country. And they would call, well, it'd be shell shock then. And they called the therapy reconstruction work. They would have them, you know, doing baskets and weaving and outdoors with athletics. You know, I'm not sure how well it worked, but they were trained. Now this is another little Roosevelt thing. In the parks, especially Delaware Park, a lot of the roads and trails were heavily forested. Olmsted's idea was as you walk through these heavily wooded areas, that the stress of city living would kind of unconsciously fall away as you were looking at the scenery. But then Roosevelt's philosophy of the strenuous life started taking hold, and people became more athletic, and the park started having baseball fields and extended the golf course and had tennis courts, which surprisingly Roosevelt loved tennis. He built a tennis court at the White House.
Yes.
So a lot of these wooded areas disappeared. There's very few of them left in the parks now. And some of these stayed. Yeah, these were all the ones I dropped. There's the Soldiers Monument with the Romanesque library in the background. And at that time, it wasn't just a library, because the art museum and the science museum hadn't been built yet. So they were the art gallery and the science museum as well as the library. It's the artwork. Part of the museum. Got torn down in 1963 to build a new one this year. I was just shot of downtown with the Erie County Savings Bank and the Morgan building behind it. They were both torn down in 1968 to do Main Place. Now in front of it is one of those sightseeing cars. Were pretty popular at the turn of the century. Saw one at Soldiers' Place, and that's how they would go around. There's Ellicott Square, soon after it was built, and the crowds downtown are really something. There's view of downtown. Question I have is, how come there's 3 towers at the Statler Hotel? No, Ellsworth Statler. He had quite an ego. And there's downtown again, crowded. You see, those days are long gone. Do all their shopping downtown. There's one of the open air markets on Washington Street. You see another one on Chippewa on Broadway. And Buffalo always wanted to have business come in, so these were early cards advertising that they were friendly to business. And then the Larkin office buildings. A city repossessed it for back taxes in 1945. And by 1948, they decided to try and sell it. Original price was $125,000, no takers. So they advertised it again, and a trucking company offered to buy it for $5,000. And they sold it to them. There was supposed to be a truck terminal there. But the trucking company, after it had been torn down, decided they wanted another location in the city, and not that one. And the city was okay with it because they would be collecting the same taxes. So Larkin office building turned into a parking lot. In the entertainment district, there was the Erlanger Theater, which was opposite the Statler. It's an office now. But they hosted some fairly famous actors early in their careers. They had minor roles. Charlton Heston, second one down. Eli Wallach is at the end. And then it's a Catherine Cornell play. She was a fairly famous local actress. Oh. Katharine Hepburn came through a couple times with plays. This one's got Bob Fosse, Carl Reiner, Buddy Hackett. And in the late 30s, this was the staff at the Shays Buffalo. And there's a harbor view showing how busy it was at one time. And this is a typical sailing boat lake freighter. 1880s, 1890s, they were pretty common. And this one, it's hand colored. But what's interesting here is the water taxis. They had a notch in the back where the oar would fit in, and you could scull it from the back because it had more room for passengers than freight. And it's unique to Buffalo. There are no other places that have this type of water taxi. And there's a sort of a, if you go to Point Lake in the summer and you look at the rowboats there, then Maritime Museum that built them, paid homage to this. All the boats have a little notch in the back. And here I have, was fascinated by when they didn't have any barriers at Niagara Falls, how close you could get with your kids nonetheless. You know, just bring your whole family and sit there right next to the falls. And does anybody know what led to the decline of top hats? Early cars did not have tops to them. So the top hats would blow off all the time. So they wanted ones that fitted tire derbies and bowlers. Here she is. Close. And they used to harvest ice on the Niagara River. Must have been tough with that current. There's some of the stunts. London. It's kind of a tame one. I haven't gotten slides of his more famous ones where he carried his miniature on his shoulders across. And he carried an oven across and cooked breakfast for himself. His great rival, Beverly, who did stuff with his manager too. He put him in the wheelbarrow and got him across. This is Senorita Bellini. Spelterini. She would tie buckets to her feet and walk across. Can't see the writing very well, but this guy in a high wheeler would ride around towns advertising movies. And he was in Niagara Falls the day that a man went over and died. So he talks about it in his letter, his postcard. And this was the guy. Let me see. George to thank us. You built that barrel so well and was so heavy that it got stuck under the balls for 20 hours and he suffocated. But he brought along his 100-year-old pet turtle, Sonny, who lived. And there's Red Hill Sr. He was a great riverman, rescued a lot of people out of the rapids and the whirlpool, and recovered a lot of bodies went over. And he's holding the turtle. Now his son, Red Hill Jr., decided that he was going to go over the falls. And he concocted this sort of a weird way of doing it with inflated tires and netting and strapping. I don't know what he was thinking, but he went over, they retrieved it, and all they found were shoes. They did find his body a few days later. Why he thought they would hold together, I have no idea. Now, this is the suspension bridge in Niagara Falls across the whirlpool in rapids. This is obviously a high wheeler club, but what gets me is all these people that are up on the wire. It was built in 1848 and torn down in 1890.
They're jumping?
No, it looks like they're clinging to the wire. Looked like it'd be a pretty dangerous thing to jump, especially with the whirlpool there. There's some other climbers. And that guy in the black suit that's standing on the railing, it appears he has a dog or a cat right next to him. And why I brought this up was that, in 1851, the Fugitive Slave Act was signed by Millard Fillmore, by the way. It allowed bounty hunters to come up north and capture slaves and bring them back, captured the freemen. And this suspension bridge was the last stop on the Underground Railroad. Once you got across, you were in Canada, where they were totally free. And Harriet Tubman actually walked a few of the groups over. A lot of them ended up in St. Catharines, where there's a population of their descendants live there now. Now, this is the last one. I had to bring in Mickey Mouse. This is advertising for a dairy in Niagara Falls. 1931. Mickey and Minnie were created in 1928. So it's probably one of the first uses of Disney characters for advertising in Western New York. And the arrow's pointing to Tony, who wrote his girlfriend. That was him. But how elaborate it is, the dress, and everyone's got a glass of milk, and the costumes are just perfect. That's it.
Thank you, Jim. Those not in the room. Thank you, Jim.
One more thing.
Yes.
There's stereo views and players here, stereo viewers, if you want to sample what they're like. And what I did, put these off to the side. I have blank postcards that are at least 100 years old. If you take them, you must promise to send them to a friend or family with a cheerful message. So help yourself to those.
Thank you for sharing just a small portion of your collection. For those who don't know Jim as well as some of our collection staff here at the site, this is just scraping the top for the Mendola collection. So thank you for taking time to share some of this with us. Do we have any questions in the room or on the chat?
Not on the chat right now, but if wondering if we have anybody in the room with questions.
I just want to say, I learned something new tonight. I didn't know jalopy was a real thing until I felt that was a real thing. Well, thank you, Jim. It was a true pleasure to have you with us this evening. Just a couple of reminders for everyone this evening. We're coming up on a very important week, as you know. The TR site will serve as a voter registration location on Thursday, Friday, and this Saturday as well. So if you know anyone who's not registered to vote for the general election, they can vote here till 3 p.m. on Saturday the 26th. Also, we will open on Saturday as an early voting destination, Saturday the 26th through the following Sunday. In lieu of TR's birthday coming up on the 27th and Halloween, we're also hosting a costume contest. So anyone who comes in dressed as Teddy Roosevelt himself will get half off their admission from the 26th through November 1st in celebration of the holiday.
And all ages can participate.
And all ages can participate, that's right. Well, thank you for being with us this evening. We have some goodies over here to the side, and thank you to those who are with us online. We hope to see you soon.